You are listening to Down Home. A growing rebel alliance fights against a tyrannical force hell-bent on conquering their land so that they can benefit from the rich natural resources. I bet our listeners are scratching their heads thinking, are Jay and Deke doing movie reviews now? Are they talking about the new Avatar movie? I wouldn't blame you for coming to this conclusion, because this story seems like it came directly from some Hollywood production script. But it's more accurate to say that some Hollywood producer looked at this history, changed the names, and came up with $1 billion blockbuster. The history of the Jamaican Maroons is that rich. In this episode, Jay and I talk about the Maroons and how a few of these freedom fighters ended up in Nova Scotia.
Breaking new ground, 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 breaking new ground.
All right, well, we're looking at the Maroons. The reason why we wanted to look at the Maroons was because of their brief history in Nova Scotia. But I remember, and I'll probably cover this on the intro, but going and looking at a social studies book, and there was literally two little paragraphs on the Maroons and how they came to Nova Scotia and helped build Citadel Hill.
Mm-hmm.
So I always did wonder, what was there more to do? Was there more behind the Maroons?
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that they actually have a very, very rich and long history. And of course, it begins in Jamaica.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1553, there was a revolt of Spanish slaves, African born, in Jamaica. The overwhelming colonists at the time were Spanish, and the slaves revolted.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
basically they went to the hillsides, and that's where the Maroons stayed and grew in numbers. Each runaway slave during that time period kind of grew their numbers. So it's interesting. I was looking at a historian, Nova Scotia historian, who said that everyone wants to be descended from the Maroons because they have such a interesting backstory, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were kind of considered like kind of rebel rousers too, right?
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
Like you wonder if because they had numbers.
Yeah.
Back then, 1500, they didn't have the type of military technology that the Spanish had,
Right.
but they had the numbers, right? So you wonder if what would have happened if the African slaves that came over and were planted in the southern states, if they were able to cohesively come together,
and join forces.
Result.
Yeah.
But the thing is, though, the difference being, and from what I read, because these slaves that were revolting in Jamaica were all from the same regions. They spoke the same languages.
Yeah.
They had the same cultures. Where a lot of the slaves that were brought over in the States, because of the slave trade and auctions and stuff like that, you were putting a lot of people together on these plantations that were of different cultures, different dialects.
Yeah.
Right.
And they sometimes couldn't communicate properly.
Exactly.
And most of them couldn't read.
Yeah.
So how could you sort of build a cohesive thing? And then the with the monkey on your back of working in the fields every day and busting your ass for that, right? Yeah.
So that's kind of like the impetus, right? That was able to give them that rebel rousing and rebellious history.
Yeah.
But 1500. So the Spanish were there, and the Maroons of the time, they started this rebellion, and at the time the Buccaneers, the British Buccaneers, who went down to the Caribbean, were seen as rebels.
Right.
So these guys were what we call now like pirates, basically, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they sided with the Maroons, right? to try and take on the Spanish of the time.
Right.
And, by 100 years later, by 1655, the British, through their buccaneer system, these pirates actually conquered much of Jamaica with the Maroon help.
Wow. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So it is interesting, isn't it, man? So, and of course the Spanish, a lot of the Spanish at that time, they took off and they went to Cuba.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So this is where it's an interesting history of the area, because that's where, we've been to Cuba a lot. The Cuban people, of course, they have their Spanish roots. Yeah. But you have your dark skin Cubans. Yeah. You have your light skin Cubans. So a lot of the dark skinned Cubans probably came from Jamaica and stuff like this. Yeah. So these were slaves that were brought over with the Spanish when they left Jamaica. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, man. Yeah.
So interesting. Yeah.
So yeah, but again, that calm and rebellious heart, that spirit, the Maroons did not want to, basically they eventually looked at the British as just new colonizers. Right. Yeah. So when the British conquered much of Jamaica, the British then turned to the Maroons for labor. Right. And then they brought more slaves over, because the British were deep into the slave trade at that time too, 1655.
Yeah, certainly. Right. Yeah.
So but the Maroons didn't stand by. They continued. They actually occupied a mountainous region, called the cockpit. Oh, and cool. From the cockpit, it was literally just like mountain and bush. Right. So from the cockpit, they actually would conduct raids on these plantations, the sugar plantations, right? Right. Every now and then. So they always raided these plantations, freeing slaves here and there. Absconding stuff, things of that nature, right?
Yeah. Well, they were like the revolution, I guess, at the time,
Yeah.
Because not too many people stood up like that, right?
Yeah. But the thing is, the British, they couldn't deal with the Maroons, because they couldn't fight them hand to hand in the mountainous regions. They didn't know the area. Yeah. And again, the British weren't large in number. There was only a few, right? So instead of fight the Maroons head on, they continuously tried to make peace treaties with the Maroons. Right. Yeah. So they did make one treaty. It was 1660. And the Maroon leader's name was Lubolo, right? And so he served the British governor at the time and the colonel, and he tried to put the Maroons in line at the time, but that didn't actually go over well. Right. So he was actually assassinated.
Oh, really?
Yeah, man. It's like I'm surprised the movie hasn't been made about this.
Yeah, that's true, man. Because I didn't know. I don't know. I mean, like you said, I know very little about the Maroons, man. That blurb in the textbook.
Yeah.
Seriously,
man. Yeah. So and then the killing of Lobolo actually set off another 100 years of war.
Yeah,
between the British and the Maroons.
Yeah.
And again, the British could not get a foothold in Jamaica. Yeah. So yeah, they called it a mountain. In some of the textbooks I saw, they called it a mountain fortress, the area that the Maroons actually encompassed, right?
Now, what was was it the Maroons? I don't know, that sort of were gathered in Nova Scotia and try to do a revolt and head back to Sierra Leone, or or was that something different?
No, it's sort of is the same thing. So by that time, so that was by the time that all this happened was 1795. So just after the Loyalists came.
Right.
And a little known fact, because I had no idea too, right, was that the Loyalists of the time, so they were quite discouraged about the conditions that they actually went into after emigrating to Nova Scotia.
Right.
So they actually were in the midst of a tiny revolt.
Yes. Okay.
So
Now I remember.
so they refused some of the land. They were unhappy about the farming conditions, the fact that the land was not farmable, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there were in the midst of a tiny revolt. So the British, around same time, 1795, that this revolt was going on, the British had enough of there was the one group of Maroons that would not abide by any treaty.
Yeah.
They were called the Trelawney Town Maroons, right?
Okay.
There was this one group of, so they actually were taken by the Brits. They had signed a peace treaty, but the thing is, the peace treaty, of course, was in English, and there's some conjecture that the Trelawney Maroons had no idea what they were signing, right? So the British, using that as an excuse, actually said, okay, well, we're the British in Jamaica, I should say, used that excuse to actually say, hey, these people are a problem. We're going to ship them off. And there so happened there was actual ship in the harbor that was bound for Nova Scotia, which is another British colony, right?
Right.
So without the knowledge of the governor in Nova Scotia, the Brits in Jamaica put the Trelawney Maroons, about 550 of them, on the ship bound,
and sent them
there along with a stipend, basically a cash bribe for the governor of Nova Scotia.
Right.
So once the Trelawney Maroons landed in Nova Scotia, the governor at the time in Nova Scotia said, "Okay, great. These guys are soldiers." He actually utilized them to put down the black loyalist
that were causing trouble.
That were causing trouble.
Yeah,
I didn't know this, man. Did you know? Like, isn't that it's kind of a dark part of our Nova Scotian history?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I didn't know, but yeah, in some of the research, the story's there. Yeah. And then so it must have been a mixture, because then they wanted to go back to Africa, right?
Well, no, it's initially it took a little while.
Yeah.
So the British governor at the time was like, okay, well, I got this money. Let's put these Maroons to work. So besides the military work of putting down the unrest, they gave them like low paying farming jobs.
Yeah.
They put the Maroons to work refurbishing Citadel Hill. But
then they revolted against that, right?
Well, there was unrest because they, these Maroons, they rejected the low paying physical labor.
Jobs,
Again, the British were making promises that they didn't keep. Yeah. Just like they did to the Loyalists, which actually precipitated the revolt that the Loyalists were in the first
place. Yeah, and then it's just the same narrative was kept. Put these blacks to work.
Yeah,
seriously. Yeah.
So there was a talk that, okay, well, we're not happy with the barren, farmland that you're offering in the Prestons. We don't like the low-paying service jobs that you want. So the Maroons wanted out.
Yeah.
So again, just so happened, because the British had ships going everywhere, they had a ship that was on its way to Sierra Leone. So the British basically struck two birds with one stone. The really troublesome black loyalists, they put them on that ship to Sierra Leone. As well as any of the Maroons that wanted to go as well. Yeah. So there's some actual discussion amongst historians how many of the Maroons left.
Yeah.
It's the number recorded that I saw was around 520 to 530. The original number that came down was 550. So but it's human nature. Not everyone's going to leave, right?
Yeah, exactly. And some of them stayed. Well, you mentioned in the Prestons, a big sort of black community in Nova Scotia, Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. Huge important part of our history. And, the fact that some of the Maroons were linked to that and the sort of the settling of that is pretty cool, you know?
Yeah. So yeah, they're all up. The Maroons were only in Nova Scotia, the majority of them, from like 1795. They were only there for like, I think it was like 4 years. That they were in they were in Halifax for about 4 years.
Wow, that's a short amount of time.
Yeah, I know, but you don't hear these things. I think the history of the Maroons in Nova Scotia has been romanticized,
Yeah, probably.
and a lot of that has to do with the fact that the Maroon history in Jamaica is so engaging and rebellious, right?
Yeah.
But the majority of them actually got on a boat again and went to Sierra Leone, where that's where they took roots.
Yeah, and at the beyond the veil of it all is the fact that, you know, the Maroons were, the head of these revolts and stuff. And it's kind of cool to see these stories because you actually look at the reason why, like, that, sometimes that history pundits don't want to look at, or that history that's sort of whitewashed and disappears. Like, you wonder why is the fact that, sort of blacks even speak out today in about what's going on. Like, this is where it stems from. So to see these histories, why these things happened and why they tried to stand up and wanted to fight for freedom.
Yeah.
These are the things that people don't want to talk about.
Oh yeah, and it all comes down to this colonist mentality that the Brits. But it wasn't only the Brits.
No, I know.
It was the Spanish.
Yeah.
It was the French.
Yeah.
Like
Portuguese.
the Portuguese, these very powerful nations that reached out amongst the globe to colonize the world and reap the world of its riches. The British were only in Jamaica because of the sugar cane. Right? Well, if there was nothing to be planted and reaped the reward of, they wouldn't be there. Why were the Brits in Nova Scotia? The lumber.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
the natural resources. This is why the Brits were there. Yeah.
Taking control of the resources and gaining that power, right?
Yeah, and it goes on to in this world too.
Of course.
Not to get all controversial and stuff. But okay, why were the Americans in the Middle East? The oil.
Yeah. Exactly.
So it's that attitude that has proliferated forward. But it's good to see and hear these histories of people groups of people that stood up and say, we're not going to go along with this, right?
Yeah.
And that's what the Maroons did.
Yeah.
And their history is long. It's rich, and it's good to see that little bit of it that came to Nova Scotia for a couple of years, man.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it also gives us a little bit more insight into our ever expanding sort of trip down the rabbit hole of where our people came from, how things were established, what they went through, and from a different perspective, that history that we don't even know about, or they still don't teach in schools. Yeah,
so, true.
Breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground.
You have been listening to Down Home. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Breaking new ground, 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 yeah. On a high plateau, from the one down below to the future of the funk, getting lost in the flow. Contact with the spot magex. Now it's time to flex with the force from the soul, reaching all aspects, getting deep, no time to sleep. As you reach your next phase, laying it all on the line. New trails start to blaze. It's a fire inside, a brand new path, breaking down the sum to one. Feeling free, I just laugh with the joy of a beat boy, just kicking it live. A connection so strong, transcribed with the vibe like magic prescribed. Only to see the perfect.
The song Breaking New Ground from The Breakdown.
what you find. Revolution starts with the evolution of the mind. It's a rhythm of circumference that rotates around to the surface with a purpose, breaking new ground.